Okay, let's unpack this. We hear so much about the promise of decentralization. Systems that are meant to be unstoppable, genuinely resistant to censorship,
Right.
where code is law, control is spread out, not in one place. It really paints this picture of true autonomy and resilience.
That ideal is absolutely the core vision. And it's powerful, right? Permissionless access, anyone can join in, transactions nobody can block. Trust coming from math, from crypto proofs, transparent data you can't change, systems that just keep running. The protocols themselves, they're just the rule books, really. The potential is just huge.
And this is the big but, isn't it? Is what's actually being built living up to that amazing promise? That's the question hanging over everything. There's this term floating around, decentralization theater.
Yeah, I've seen that.
It suggests some systems, they might look decentralized, they tick the boxes, use the buzzwords, but underneath, maybe there are hidden central controls or these critical single points of failure.
It's definitely about that gap, the difference between the appearance of decentralization and the actual reality of where the control or the vulnerability really lies.
So our mission for this deep dive is to try and pull back that curtain. We want to get a handle on what this decentralization theater actually means.
Okay.
How common is it out there in the crypto world right now? And we really want to zoom in on one specific massive dependency, the reliance on big centralized cloud providers.
Yeah.
Like AWS.
Yeah.
Especially now in 2025.
Right, the cloud infrastructure piece.
Exactly. And then let's really chew on what could happen if these huge tech companies decided maybe not to play nicely with crypto anymore.
Yeah, that's a critical question. And we've looked at a bunch of stuff for this: definitions, technical details, past events, even some interesting parallels from totally outside crypto that show similar patterns.
Okay, good. So let's get into the nuts and bolts. We know the ideal permissionless, resistant, resilient. Where does the theater actually start creeping in? How does that central control sneak back?
Well, often it's in how these systems are actually built and run, even if they're built on decentralized tech. You could have a decentralized base layer, but still have central points.
Like what?
Like some systems rely heavily on just a few specific nodes, maybe nodes run by the project's foundation or some committee.
Okay.
Now, if the network gets really popular, tons of users, tons of transactions, but the number of those special critical nodes stays small, the system actually becomes less decentralized in proportion to its size.
Wait, hang on. So a project could get less decentralized just by becoming more successful if those core bits don't also spread out.
Precisely. It's about the concentration of critical functions. Governance is another huge area. DAOs, decentralized autonomous organizations.
Supposedly decentralized decision-making, right?
Yeah.
Token holders vote.
That's the vision.
Yeah.
But sources point out some real issues. Like, it can be really expensive to buy enough tokens to actually have a meaningful vote, so power ends up with the wealthy. Or maybe the interests of a few big holders don't match what most users want. And accountability. What happens when a vote leads to something bad? It's often unclear. Plus, some projects, they still keep special admin keys for the core team.
Admin keys. In a decentralized organization, that sounds kind of contradictory.
It really does challenge that core idea of distributed control, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And it's not just governance. Think about smart contracts. We always hear they're unstoppable, immutable code is law.
That's the whole selling point. Automatic, unchangeable agreements.
The ideal, yeah. But the reality, many smart contracts get deployed with pause functions built right in.
Pause functions so they can be stopped.
Exactly. Developers put them there, often with good intentions, like maybe to halt things during a hack or to fix a critical bug. We saw examples, the Cork protocol hack, multi-chain.
Oh.
A pause might have helped limit the damage there.
Okay, so for emergencies.
But the fact that the function exists means there's a human switch, a central point of control that can override the unstoppable contract. It kind of goes against that whole immutability principle.
Okay, so we've got potential human overrides in contracts, concentrated power in governance. What about things the system needs from outside? Dependencies.
Yeah, critical point.
Yeah.
A protocol is only as strong as its weakest link, especially external ones. If your DeFi system needs price data, it relies on an oracle, right? That oracle is a dependency.
Yeah.
Even if you have backups like Liquidity apparently uses Chainlink, but has Teller as a backup. You're still relying on these external things, and this gets really interesting with NFTs.
Right, NFTs, the blockchain proves you own the digital thing.
Sort of. This smart contract on the chain, often it just holds a link,
A link to where?
usually to the actual digital file, the image, the video stored on a totally normal centralized web server, like AWS S3 or something. So if that server goes down, or the company running it pulls the plug, or the link just breaks over time, your on-chain contract suddenly points to nothing. It's inaccessible.
Yeah.
Your decentralized, immutable asset effectively vanishes because a regular server somewhere had an issue. That's a huge disconnect, you know?
Definitely. So the core asset isn't really decentralized if it lives off-chain like that. What about just, like, the website you use to interact with the protocol?
The front end, yeah, that's another potential weak spot. If the website itself is hosted centrally and gets attacked or just goes offline, you might lose your main way to access the underlying decentralized service. Now, sometimes for things like DXs, savvy users might find other front ends or interact directly with the contract, but for most people, the main website is the gateway, and it's often centralized.
Okay, so there are quite a few ways control or dependency seems to stick around.
Yeah.
Why does this happen? Why the theater? Is it deliberate deception?
Sources suggest it's usually not about trying to trick people, it's more about really tough trade-offs. Getting to true, full decentralization across every single layer. It's incredibly hard, it takes time, it costs a lot.
Right.
So developers have to balance that ideal against practical stuff, like scalability. Can this thing handle millions of users without grinding to a halt? Security, how do we protect it? Usability, can normal people actually figure out how to use it?
Makes sense.
Sometimes just using existing centralized stuff like cloud services or centralizing some functions, at least initially, is just faster, cheaper, maybe performs better, or leverages tech that already works well. Plus, there isn't really one clear, objective definition of sufficiently decentralized everyone agrees on. That leaves room for interpretation, you know?
It really sounds like the easiest path, the path of least resistance, often leads back towards centralization, even unintentionally. And this isn't just a crypto thing, is it? There was that interesting parallel in the sources about local government in Ghana.
Yeah, that analogy was surprisingly relevant. It really highlights the core pattern. The goal in Ghana was similar. Bring government closer to the people, more participation, more local control, decentralized power.
Sounds familiar.
But even though they set up local government bodies, these bodies were still super dependent on funding from the central government.
Ah, the money trail.
Exactly, and that financial dependency plus political influence from the center controlling who gets appointed, things like that meant the local bodies couldn't really act on their own. Citizen participation was encouraged, but it often felt like, well, the source used words like manipulation and therapy.
Wow, manipulation and therapy. That's
Right.
quite a phrase.
It captures that feeling, right? The appearance of participation, the facade of local control, but without the actual substance because of those underlying dependencies. It shows how this dynamic can play out anywhere, not just tech.
That really drives the point home. Speaking of dependencies, let's pivot back to the big tech one, the cloud. How reliant is the crypto world on providers like AWS and Azure right now in 2025?
Oh, it's huge. It's really significant and very current. We're not talking hypotheticals. As of now, 2025, companies like AWS and Microsoft Azure are not just used by crypto projects. They're actively courting them, supporting Web3 development.
Okay, so they're leaning into it. What exactly are crypto projects using these centralized clouds for? Surely not the core blockchain operations.
Well, actually, yes, for really critical stuff. Deploying and running nodes, validator nodes that secure the network, full nodes that store the history. That often happens on cloud servers.
Truly.
Yeah. And building all the data infrastructure around blockchains, things like indexers, data warehouses that need to constantly pull data from nodes. A lot of that runs on the cloud, querying nodes that are also often on the cloud.
Okay.
And maybe most crucially, RPC nodes. These are like the on-ramps and off-ramps for the blockchain. When your wallet or a dApp needs to read data or send a transaction, it often goes through an RPC node.
Hosted on AWS or Azure?
Very frequently, yes. That's the bottleneck, potentially.
So basically, when I use my crypto wallet or a DeFi app, the signal might be bouncing off an Amazon server farm somewhere.
In many, many cases, that's exactly what's happening. And we saw real proof of how interconnected this all is just recently, remember, April 15th, 2025.
Ah, right, the AWS outage.
Exactly. It was a technical problem in one AWS region, but it caused ripples across a big chunk of the crypto industry. Major exchanges, Binance, KuCoin, MEXC had problems.
Yeah, I remember seeing that.
Other platforms, too, like Coinstore, Gate.io, DeBank, Rabby Wallet.
Oh, yeah.
Now, apparently, no user funds were lost this time, but the outage itself was a stark demonstration, wasn't it? A single failure point in one company's centralized infrastructure caused widespread disruption in a supposedly decentralized ecosystem.
Yeah.
And sources specifically mentioned big names like Coinbase, BitMEX, Kraken, Crypto.com, Huobi as being heavily reliant on AWS.
So that outage wasn't just a glitch. It was like a live fire drill showing this deep structural dependency. Why, again, are projects making this choice, knowing the risks?
It comes back to those trade-offs we talked about. Convenience, mostly. The sources point to things like potential cost savings versus running your own hardware.
Right.
Better performance, lower latency sometimes, higher transaction throughput, easier integration with all the data analysis tools they already use. It's powerful, reliable infrastructure that's just there.
The easy button.
Kind of. Despite the whole ideal of having thousands of independent people running nodes all over the world, for many projects, especially bigger ones, leaning on the cloud giants is just the more practical path. And interestingly, user behavior often mirrors this.
How so?
Well, sources noted that even people who talk a big game about decentralization might still keep most of their coins on a centralized exchange or mostly use apps that clearly rely on centralized cloud backbones. Convenience often trumps principle in practice.
That's a really interesting observation about user behavior reflecting the infrastructure choices. Okay, so the reliance is deep. It's proven by outages. Now, the big what if. What happens if AWS or Microsoft or Google Cloud decides, you know what? We don't want to support crypto companies anymore. Not an accident, but a choice.
That April outage was the tremor, the warning shot, right? It showed the vulnerability. A deliberate decision by one or more of these major providers, that would be an earthquake.
Why might they do that? Regulators breathing down their necks? Politics?
Yeah.
Just a business decision?
Could be any of those.
Yeah.
Regulatory pressure is a big potential one, political shifts, or just deciding the risk or hassle isn't worth it for them anymore. If they did decide to restrict or just completely deny service, the impact would be massive.
How bad? What breaks first?
Well, any platform heavily using them for hosting those nodes we talked about, managing databases, running all the backend code, analytics, all that gets severely disrupted, maybe goes offline entirely. It hits right at the heart of the resilience idea.
Yeah.
If critical pieces of your unstoppable system are running on infrastructure that a third party can just switch off, then it's not really unstoppable or censorship resistant in practice, is it?
Definitely not. Are there decentralized alternatives people could switch to? Decentralized cloud computing?
Yes, that area is definitely growing. Things like Filecoin, Arweave for storage, Akash for compute. There's momentum there. But the sources are pretty clear. Today, in 2025, the overwhelming majority of cloud usage in crypto is still the big centralized players.
So not ready for prime time as a full replacement yet.
Not at the scale needed if AWS suddenly pulled out tomorrow. A forced sudden migration would be chaotic. Projects would scramble to either build their own costly infrastructure incredibly quickly or shift to these less mature, decentralized alternatives under pressure. It would be a huge shock to the system's stability.
Okay, so pulling this all together, we've got the governance loopholes like admin keys, the smart contracts that can be paused, the critical data stored off-chain on regular servers, and this really profound reliance on centralized cloud infrastructure, which that AWS outage just threw into sharp relief. How common does all this make decentralization theater? Is it everywhere?
Based on everything we've looked at, yeah, it seems pretty common. Certainly much more common than the pure, fully decentralized ideal. So many major platforms, exchanges, they have these significant centralized dependencies, especially the cloud one. You've got those control points in contracts and governance, the routine reliance on off-chain data, oracles. Even the push for institutional adoption seems to be leading towards more permissioned, more centrally manageable models for compliance sake.
Right.
And like we said, user behavior often leans towards convenience too. So yeah, it feels like most systems aren't purely decentralized or purely centralized. They exist somewhere on a spectrum, making these practical compromises. The result is often this degree of theater. The appearance doesn't always perfectly match the underlying structure of control and dependency.
It really paints a complex, maybe slightly less glamorous picture than the initial pitch sometimes. The vision is still incredibly powerful, right? These unstoppable open systems.
Yeah.
But the reality of building and running them seems to involve constant, difficult choices.
Yeah, trade-offs.
That often lead back to familiar centralized patterns, especially dependence on existing big tech infrastructure like the cloud giants.
That certainly seems to be the state of play right now, based on the sources.
So I guess the big question to leave everyone with is, given this widespread reliance on centralized foundations and just how hard it is to achieve that pure decentralized ideal in practice, can the crypto ecosystem truly deliver on that original promise? Can it be fundamentally unstoppable and censorship resistant?
Or will the need for scale, speed, cost-effectiveness, usability, will those pressures always mean some level of theater is necessary, always leaving that door open for centralized failure points or control? And if that's the case, what does it really mean for the future of DeFi Web3 and this whole idea of shifting power? Something to definitely think about.